Shall we start? We can start?
Shall we start? Is that, yeah? Is it going to be? You already introduced everybody. Okay, great. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here on the second day of the Zinnov Confluence event. And it's a little after 3:30, it's about 3:40 now. Maybe a couple of hours after your sumptuous lunch. So I'm assuming that all the digestive juices, the microbes, the enzymes are really doing their work. So the objective of this panel is to ensure that you don't go off to sleep. More importantly, we also don't go off to sleep. So the point being that we will keep all of this interactive, conversational, and hopefully informative, right? Which means I really encourage all of you to participate, ask questions, because that's the best way to learn. And what we will do is try to the best of our ability to raise issues, answer them, that hopefully will be of value to all of you. Sounds all right? Yeah, and we'll keep some time at the end for Q&A. Sounds okay? Excellent, great. Yeah. So, the topic is the true valuation of technology businesses. So when I read that, I was a little confused because I didn't quite understand what true would mean, because beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. So is there anything called an absolute or true valuation? And what we will do is we'll kind of move around in a round robin format. Anyone can jump in at any point in time. I think we ensure that we're able to respond to the query. So that's really the first question. I mean, what is true valuation, or is there any such thing at all? Girish?
Yeah, so I think it has been said elsewhere as well that people sometimes get confused between valuation and pricing, and they are not the same thing. For valuation, there is enough fundamental principles you can use, from cash flow to present value and so on, whereas pricing in some ways has nothing to do with valuation. It has to do with supply and demand, and also it has to do with momentum, what the mood in the market at that point of time is, what other people are doing, and that decides pricing. So sometimes people say that, oh, these people are just getting together in a group and throwing numbers and deciding valuation. But the reality is that because there is so much uncertainty involved in the startup world, and because data points are very few, because there is a lot of lack of transparency about how numbers have been arrived at, the tendency is to not to do kind of ground up valuation based on cash flow or present value, but to look more at comparables, to look more at what the market mood is, what the supply demand is, and then decide on valuation.
So it's essentially what you're saying is largely qualitative.
No, there are data points, but different data points.
Different data points.
Not based on necessarily what the cash flow of the business is, what revenues are, what profitability will be, will the company survive or not survive. Those probably are not easy to understand because of the uncertainties and lack of data points. So people use the other proxy, which is supply and demand. What are the people doing? What have other startups done? So that becomes a pricing game rather than a valuation.
Valuation game. What about you, Rutvik? Do you agree?
No, I agree with what Girish is saying, and also like to add that, valuation, it is qualitative in nature. It is very, very subjective. But at the end of the day, whatever the valuation is assigned to a company is transient, it's temporary, it doesn't really matter because it's always on paper. What matters is that whenever some transaction happens, at that point in time, as like what Girish was suggesting, there's a price that is attached to it, and that's what matters a lot. We keep hearing on the papers that XYZ company is valued at $1 billion, now suddenly it has become $5 billion, then from 5 it goes back to 2, and sometimes it jumps up to 10, 15. So these are all theoretical numbers which do not really mean much. They all come out of some exercise which a bunch of people do using Excel and pop out a number.
So nobody should get excited by just reading the press.
Yeah, no, nobody should get excited by reading any of those numbers on the press, because at the end of the day, what matters is at what price did the transaction happen. And usually the price is such in which the buyer is happy that, or at least feels that I got it for cheap, and the seller feels that I got a deal out of it. That's the...
So both the parties are happy.
Both the parties at the end of the day are happy, and that's what the true, in some sense, the valuation at the end of the day is.
Shailesh, as a serious investor across stages from a very well-known fund, what are your views?
Valuation to us is probability. At one extreme, you would have a government bond that pays a fixed return, and it's very easy to understand what that is worth. You can discount the cash flows, and there's a high degree of certainty. But in venture capital, or in the very early stages of a company, you're betting on human potential and what a team and a market might happen, what might happen there. And when we invest, we're betting for a chance, a probability that that turns into something
option price,
significant. So it's just that. You know, when we invest in the earlier stages, we usually only think about how much of the company we can own, such that if it becomes something significant, it becomes something meaningful for us and our shareholders or our investors. But it's just a probability. It doesn't mean much
So there's really no deterministic way to arrive at a valuation. Is that what you're saying?
At the earliest stages, but at the later stages, everything is a multiple of cash flows or discounted cash flows and the sustainability of those. So again, at the extreme, you have a government bond. Then slightly before that, you'll have things, very predictable industries, and look, even the large tech companies today trade at relatively low multiples of their earnings because the tech is an industry of disruption, and people are always concerned of how long these companies might exist. We think of just as probability. We're willing to pay more if we're more certain, willing to pay less if we're less certain.
So
And there is I think, little bit of misunderstanding that this valuation problem only arises at an early stage when we don't know enough about the company and where it is going to go and so on. But I think it is there even till late stage. So if you look at Uber, which last valuation round valued at some $65 billion, but there are enough people who say that that price is wrong and it should be like $23 billion. So, and they have justification to say why it should be like that. And the reality is that 65 billion is based on one person who funded 18 months ago. So between 18 months ago today, one person funding, should we treat it as gospel truth, or should we really question whether that should be the value?
So that really leads to the question, right? I mean, is valuation a solid, a liquid, a gas? And, so how is one supposed to even look at it? So, so some of the bigger questions that arise is, if you believe that the price is what a market is willing to bear, and in most cases, if there is no market, then how does one value it? And what would you recommend? And we'll start with Shailesh now. What would be the different techniques, or let's say, analytical methods, if you will, of evaluating or trying to figure out what this valuation number ought to be?
So it really depends on the stage of the company. Something like Uber, you'll have a lot more data and analysis that you can do to see what it might be. But even a company like Uber, if self-driving cars happens, what happens to their business? And people might have very different views of what it means to them. At the earliest stages of a company, we, again, just think of ownership. Like, how much does a founder need to own, assuming he or she will need to be diluted several times in the future in subsequent rounds of funding, such that it's still meaningful for them many years later. Because there's very little to honestly, totally analyze it at such early stages when we typically invest. People probably are well aware of all the regular financial methods.
So would it be, let's say, for example, price to sales, price to cash flow? What would be, let's say, a preferred way of looking at it?
Depends on the industry. Things that have more stable margin structures, price to sales is often a reasonably good metric, but the actual number can be very different. But generally, everything is a multiple of cash flows in the end.
Multiple of cash flows. But several companies don't have cash flows,
Yep.
yet are valued very highly. And therefore, there's a whole question about how do you value the technology or the IP or the market presence of the company, right?
I remember once speaking to an investor who was investing in a large e-commerce company in India at what then seemed like a crazy price. And he said the way he thought about it is, this company has X% chance of being the winner. We believe the winner will be worth Y tens of billions. And, I'm willing to, for that chance, I'm willing to pay this.
So it goes back to your point about being an expected value of a probability.
Yes.
Right?
That's
Okay. Rutvik?
So I'll just add on to what Shailesh is saying. In some sense, sometimes it just ends up being like, buying a house. So if some of you are to, looking for a house, and say if you're looking in the Indiranagar area, you roughly know that, oh, if I'm buying a new apartment, maybe it will cost me 10,000 rupees a square feet. If I'm buying an apartment in an old building, maybe it will cost me 8,000 rupees a square feet. And there is this whole range between that numbers. There is no science behind it. Most of the people who are buying and selling houses, they do not go and do a valuation exercise of the house or anything else. It's intuitively they know that in general, all apartments in this area have been bought or sold at a certain price range. And then you add parameters like, oh, if it's a new house, it has a swimming pool attached to it and it has a gym attached to it, and we may be willing to pay 1,000 rupees more to it. If it's an old house, I may be willing to pay 1,000 rupees less for it. So it ends up, when valuations of companies also end up somewhere in that, that's the art and that's the science of valuating a company also. You look at a company and it's in your eyes that, oh, this swimming pool is very nice. Similarly, when somebody is buying a company, that, oh, this company has a very good chance of capturing a specific market or becoming a winner in area, and you may be willing to pay slightly more for it. Or for some reason, the sentiment just goes down and everybody thinks that the swimming pool is crappy. I'm going to pay less for it. So that's where how the valuation of companies is also in some sense determined. It's a lot of comparables based on what is generally happening in the market, and people have a sense for it.
Girish?
I think technology startups, especially India, have a special problem to solve. And the problem they have is that for early startups, they may not have cash flows, they may not have EBITDA, so you measure them by revenue. But many of them start in India, trying to sell to clients in India, establishing the product market fit, and then hoping to take it global, whether to US or Europe or elsewhere. But the price points in India are so much different from what it would be in the US or any other developed market, that trying to get a multiple on that revenue number is very challenging for them because it predicts a very low value. However, if you look at it from the investor point of view, assuming that just because you are able to sell in India, it means that you will be able to sell overseas is not a given, because that's a completely different challenge that you have to overcome. And many of the people who develop products in India have had more exposure to product development than to sales. So to assume that somebody who has done a great job developing a product and having sold it in India will be equally successful, taking it to market in the US or in Europe, is a level of uncertainty that gets added. But the trouble for the entrepreneurs is that they have done a great job in developing the product, but when they look for value in the marketplace and wanting it to be valued for the technology that has been created, they have a big shock and a disappointment that people are not giving them credit for what they have done technologically. The other problem that is there in India is that there are not enough second generation, third generation entrepreneurs who have done a successful exit or who know what it takes to go to market. So many of them are first time entrepreneurs. So hence the venture capitalists are that much more worried and skeptical on whether it will see ultimate success despite all the enthusiasm and passion that they have demonstrated in developing the product.
So the product market fit and then the sales process itself.
And the fact that India market is not a good proxy for the world market.
For overseas. So effectively, I think we've kind of established that valuation is somewhere between a liquid and a gas, right? I mean, there's not quite a solid yet.
Yeah.
Given that there's a lot of India development centers, product innovation centers of large global multinational corporations that are doing a lot of technology work out of India, and all of them have one way or the other some innovation program or the other running. And many of them are launching products out of India for emerging markets as well as for global markets. If you were to, Girish, given your vast experience at Wipro and elsewhere, look at how these companies should be thinking about valuing their internal processes for developing products and technology and IP and all of that, what would you say? How should they be thinking about it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting question, because when we meet young entrepreneurs and startups, many of them have worked in GICs. So they have got the experience of working for global companies, have done product development successfully. And so there is rich talent and a lot of opportunity for those young guys. I think one of the things that the venture capital market does is, however flawed it may be, and we had that discussion about how valuation is more in the eye of the beholder rather than being a science, the reality is that it gives a marketplace feedback about what the value of any idea is. And if something like that can be developed for ideas within the GIC themselves through a kind of proxy market, I think it will at least give some feedback to the people who are developing those products, saying that what is the worth of the idea that they have. And whether the current India venture capital market or the global venture capital
So how would
market.
you effect that? Meaning you have
Yeah, people
investors
coming in, like we are
participate?
sitting down together, listen to the product idea and at least say that if you were to put money behind this, would you do this or wouldn't you do this? And if you were to do this, how much money would you put?
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So at least there is an external feedback or
Got it.
external validation
Yeah.
of an internally generated idea.
What do you think, Rutvik, Shailesh?
So, sometimes I even wonder that for GICs, does it really matter what putting a valuation number to it? Is it even important or not? I think if I were somebody who's innovating within a GIC in India, I think the way I would look at it is I would try to predict what kind of sales numbers this is going to generate for my company. Is it going to improve the sales? Is it going to improve my revenue by a certain percentage? Or is it going to save cost for the company or some number like that? And benchmark myself on the overall impact that it is making to the parent company, either in terms of revenue or cost basis. And that becomes is more important than anything else. And then an easier way to look at it would be, you can look at the company revenue numbers, what its public market valuation numbers, and then if any delta that you're doing, you can attach a value to it based on those multiples. So that's one easy way of doing things. But again, there is no right or wrong answer in this.
Shailesh?
Yeah, not something we think about a lot, but I imagine that some private equity firms that might take these centers and spin them out and add third-party business to them might think about it. For those, I think there's reasonably well understood large cap and mid cap IT services companies that provide good benchmarks, and those ranges are quite defined relative to the earlier stage companies that we were discussing earlier.
But as I say, companies are building innovative new products out of India from their GICs here, right? Does it make sense at all to think of those outputs as a valuation measure? Or to just look at it more from a standpoint of, like you said, revenue enhancement, cost reduction, and innovation, efficiency, action, etc.? Or is it a valuation game?
I think it's a more theoretical exercise, as in you might say that a global innovation center out of India saves the company X amount of money, and that if you apply the multiple of the parent company to that generates X amount of value, but it's theoretical.
Okay, it's theoretical, so it doesn't really have much meaning to think of
It
the
might
output in valuation terms.
It might mean something to someone who's negotiating a salary or what they're worth to the company, but I don't think it means necessarily that.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the other issues is, when there's so much money flowing in and out, and we've seen how valuations have been fluctuating dramatically, right? Over the last 2 years, and the media's gone sort of a little wild over all kinds of predictions and so on. What is your own view? How do you see this business of valuation of technology businesses evolve in India, given that the market and the ecosystem is kind of nascent and evolving? Girish?
So I think 2-3 years back, in some ways the market had run up hugely. The expectations were high. Everybody felt that they should, have minimum so much valuation. And to some extent, at least in India, how e-commerce got valued had a knock-on effect on everything else. So people just became excited about the numbers that they read in the newspaper, what they heard from others, and just thought that's how they should get valued. I think that fever has cooled a little bit, and I think they'll probably remain like this for a little while, because the reality is that people have to see exit from the technology investment that have been made here, and not simply from the e-commerce side. And I think once people see exits, there'll be more sanity that'll come in.
Rutvik?
No, I agree with Girish here that, few years back, valuations did run up, and valuations are also a function of supply and demand. So there was more cash available for deployment, and there was higher expectations, so valuation ran up. some of those expectations have dried down, some of those cash has dried down, so valuations have come back to normal. But see, at the end of the day, these are the entry-level valuations. What will matter is the exit valuations for companies in India.
So where do you see this evolve over the next 12, 18 months?
I think they will remain where it is right now, and we will really know whether these valuations are justified or not justified only 4 or 5 years down the line once the exits start happening. And at the time of those exits, depending on what multiples we get, we will know that whatever we are doing, is it the right valuations, or are we overpaying, underpaying, what it is, and
So buckle up and sit tight.
buckle up and sit tight for the next 3-4 years.
Is that what you would say as well, Shailesh?
I think it's hard to comment on the overall market, but as Rutvik mentioned, a lot of this was determined by external liquidity. So if even the Fed funds rate has an impact on venture capital in India, so it's hard to say what exactly happens. Certainly, yeah, it's very obvious. A couple of years ago, whatever people were paying for companies was way ahead of what they were really worth. But the runway for these opportunities is still long. Like Flipkart might have been worth 15 billion back then, but will the winner in India e-commerce be worth far, far more than that? Probably 10, 20 years out. So they still might be right. So it's hard to call. It depends on your time frame, and depends how you, how much turbulence you're willing to take along the way. We see a more stable market for the next few months at least, but anything can happen and change.
A more stable market, as in status quo.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so there you have it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not valuation, it's about value. And valuation essentially is money in the mirror. You keep looking at it, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. And then depending on whether you've woken up on the wrong side of the bed, the visual in the mirror looks different. So it's all effectively that. But I think the real key message is that stay focused on building something of use rather than get confused by mythical valuation numbers that the press likes to keep talking about. Is that a fair characterization? And just focus on building something interesting and of value?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
So what we'll do now is, we've got about 3 odd minutes left. Some questions from the audience would be interesting to have now. I'm assuming there are mics out there? Yeah. So, in the front, please, here. Yeah. So please state your name, your affiliation, and if the question is addressed to any one person or to the panel.
Actually, it's addressed to all of you. I know 2 of you having considerable experience in the venture capital world, and the 2 of the others, at least Inventus and Sequoia, obviously has. But my question is this: between US and India, why should it be kind of interrelated? That if the market is down there, that is in the sense the kind of excitement, it is actually also down here. Because the GDP here is growing at a far higher percentage, number one. Number two, we want more entrepreneurs into the system. So why are we basically either relating a Fed rate to this, or for that matter, the excitement in, not much of an excitement in the US or the Silicon Valley to India in terms of nurturing entrepreneurship? Because I guess that when there is press and media about valuation, or probably sometimes overvaluation, there's a lot of excitement amongst youngsters to become entrepreneurs, which is actually really what we would want to nurture. I'm not saying that when you really put in the money, you actually put in overvalued money on that. But nevertheless, why is it that I don't see, I see a lot, when I come here, I see a lot of entrepreneurs really doing great, good job. I mean, in the sense, coming out with great products. But why is it we are not valuing it the way it should be valued?
I guess the first point you're making is, why is the excitement in Silicon Valley impacting our actions here?
Non-excitement.
Or non-excitement, whatever.
Which way?
Yeah. And why aren't we figuring out how to value interesting, innovative things ground up from here?
Yeah.
Girish?
So I think first of all we have to make a distinction between products and which are trying to address the B2C market versus the B2B market. On the B2C market, I think there is no reason to be less enthusiastic about the India market because clearly economy growing at 7-8%, demographic dividend, everything is right. So there is no reason to be other than optimistic about where the B2C businesses will grow. Yeah, of course, some will succeed, some will fail, some will succeed somewhat, but there is no fundamental or structural reason to be anything but optimistic about the B2C India market. I think the B2B is a little bit more challenging for the reason that the B2B market in India is not as big as it is in the US. And the price points at which B2B market operates is quite different from what it is in the US. So I think it will be not easy to use the same brush to paint both the B2B and the B2C markets. And as long as you make the distinction, I think you will be either very optimistic or somewhat optimistic about the two things.
Because in the US, I would imagine that a market focused on the SMB is rather like a B2C market. In India, that's a company focused on the SMB market has to treat it like it's an enterprise B2B sale.
Yeah.
You will still need a physical call to make and go through a long sales cycle and so on. Any other questions, please? Yes.
I'm Guru Raj from Allscripts. Quick question related to the business valuation of the technology business, what we're talking about. So help me understand, if I could understand what you just talked about was when you do valuation for technology business, you do to specific market. It can be an Indian market or to an European market or to a Western country market. But my questions very specifically is when you talk about technology business, taking an example of an IPTV, it's a technology business, no matter whether it is subjected to an Indian market or to a Western market. Why do you want to differentiate the valuation?
This question, if I were to paraphrase it, why do you want to attach a market to a piece of technology and arrive at a valuation? Is that right?
You're right.
Okay. Any one of you?
I can try answering your question. See, at the end of the day, what a venture capitalist, so before this panel, we were discussing what VC looks for. We all very bluntly put it that at the end of the day, venture capitalist looks for returns on their investment. And returns on the investment are also a function of the market in which the company is operating. So a return happens either by the company going IPO or the company doing an M&A at some point in time. Those are the two most commonly ways in which a venture capitalist can get return. Now, if we look at India market versus US market, the US market, the M&A ecosystem, as well as the IPO market is far more robust and far more vibrant than what India is. So India's M&A ecosystem is very shallow or very, very small, and IPO market is also very, very much smaller compared to the US markets. So the return expectation becomes lower, and hence the valuation also ends up becoming lower for the same thing.
Yeah, so I think we've run out of time. The red light is flashing here for the past 1.5 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
So I think we'll have to call it a day, right? So that we are back on track, I imagine, with regard to the schedule. So it only remains for me to thank each one of you. Thank you very much. And the audience for being a very patient audience and a participative one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.